Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we enter a new period in American history. Specifically, it's the APUSH Period 3. I've titled it Revolution and Republic because it gets us in the early days of the American Revolution and really takes us to the establishment of our new country. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. From out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to describe the roots and significance of the Stamp Act controversy, and number two, identify the key events that sharpened the divisions between Britain and the colonists in the late 1760s and early 1770s. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. In general, Great Britain didn't micromanage the colonies. They didn't oversee them and take care of all the little details from the country abroad. They really didn't have that high of an opinion of the colonists. The phrase was that colonists were people who plant tobacco and Puritanism only, like fools. In principle, all of the laws of England were applied to the colonies. They all, like everything in the mother country, would have applied to the people in the colonies. But in practice, the British used a method known as salutary neglect. The English laws were mostly ignored. Each colony had its own legislature to take care of its own individual needs, and each colony had its own governor appointed by the king to serve as its executive. The colonies were supposed to be essentially self-sufficient under the authority of the crown, but kind of on their own. After the 7 Years' War, though, things began to change. London insisted that the colonists should play a subordinate role to the mother country, and that they should go help pay for the war debt and pay for the protection that the British provided. Taxation in England, now here we're not talking about the colonies specifically, but taxation in England reached record levels in order to go pay for that French and Indian War. England decided that the colonies should help pay for that debt and to stop cheating the treasury by violating the Navigation Acts that regulated trade in the empire. Colonists argued, though, that London couldn't tax them because they were unrepresented in Parliament. No taxation without representation, goes the phrase. And Benjamin Franklin, the founding grandfather in American history, Benjamin Franklin even proposed that maybe the way that they do this fairly is that the colonies, the American colonies, should just have seats in Parliament. England countered, though, that Americans receive virtual representation because all members of Parliament speak for all British subjects, not any specific territories. So to enforce the Navigation Acts, Great Britain issued some court orders known as a writ of assistance. And these writs of assistance were general search warrants that basically anywhere that smuggled goods were suspected, the courts had a right to go intervene and go check those, check out whatever they needed to investigate. The writs, though, really alarmed the colonists. It seemed like an arbitrary power and an overreach of the crown. Subpoint B. The Prime Minister, George Grenville, introduced a law known as the Sugar Act in 1764. What's crazy is that the Sugar Act actually reduced the tax on molasses, the most important sugar variety for the colonies, but it also limited smuggling, and it created new laws to go enforce tax collection. So colonists actually paid lower taxes, but they cracked down on the black market of sugar, and in particular, it strengthened the admiralty courts, so that accused smugglers had no trial by jury. So if a smuggler was caught in a ship and tried in an admiralty court, they lost certain legal rights in order to go make the courts go faster. It also had an effect of cracking down on smuggling. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a second act. So we have the Sugar Act of 64 and the Stamp Act of 65. This act taxed any printed materials to pay for British troops in America. It required very small print markings on court documents, on land titles, etc. For us moderns, this doesn't sound like a big deal because, what's could be printed, but this was an era that not everybody had a printer in their home, or theoretically have a printer in their home. I've collected enough student essays to know that you don't have printers in your home. But what I'm saying is that printing was much more difficult, and it covered a lot of different things. The tax was far-reaching, and it basically pissed everybody off. It was the first time that taxes were used to raise revenue in British North American history. Now, it wasn't the first time there was taxes in British North America, but they were used for regulating trade, things like tariff protections. In this case, a tax, like a specific one to go raise revenue just to make the crown richer, it was deeply offensive to Americans. Opposition to the Stamp Act was the first real great drama of the Revolution and the first major split between the colonists and the British. At the request of General Thomas Gage, Parliament also passed a law known as the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act said that the colonies should provide the barracks and the food for any British troops stationed in the colonies. Parliament also approved Grenville's proposal that the Stamp Act violations, just like the Sugar Act violations, should be tried in vice admiralty courts, not just in regular civil courts. Now, Americans saw the British Empire a little differently, I think, than the way the British saw their empire. Americans believed that as British subjects, they was an association of equals, and free settlers overseas had the same rights as any settlers at home. But if the English didn't face Stamp Act and Quartering Acts in the home country, they argued then that the colony shouldn't either. For instance, here I want to introduce a Virginia legislator, kind of a firebrand of a guy named Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was a famous orator. He's a guy that could draw a crowd. He had a big voice at a big presentation, and he knew how to make an argument and really sell it. I kind of think of Patrick Henry as a talk radio sort of guy before there was talk radio. You remember talk radio? No, you don't. You're too young. But Patrick Henry introduced several of these wild resolutions in Virginia's House of Burgesses. You remember, of course, the House of Burgesses was the Virginia legislature, and here you have a colonist in the Virginia legislature introducing these like crazy resolutions denouncing the Stamp Act. He insisted the colonies had the same liberties, the same privileges, franchises, and immunities as those people in the mother country, and that consenting to taxes was a hallmark of what he identified as British freedom. The hall of the House of Burgesses was packed when when Patrick Henry spoke. And there was actually, this is kind of a fun side note, there was two people in the crowd that will become very important to our cause soon. It was a lawyer in the English colonies, a man named Thomas Jefferson, and a British soldier named George Washington. And Patrick Henry begins his line where he says, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I and his Cromwell, and George III," and then like people interrupt him. They say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." They say, "I know this story. Caesar had his Brutus. Brutus was the one that killed Caesar. And Cromwell was the one who killed Charles I. And now, Patrick Henry, the next line, George III." They said, "Stop before you commit treason." Patrick Henry paused, and then he finished, "That George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it." Several, not all, but several of Patrick Henry's wild resolutions passed the House of Burgesses that day. In October of 1765, 27 delegates from 9 different colonies gathered in the city of New York to discuss Virginia's proposals. This Stamp Act Congress endorsed Virginia's position, and Parliament accidentally unified the 13 colonies. Before this moment, the colonies operated independently. They were like little small, I don't want to call them countries because they're colonies, but a person from New York really didn't have much to do with the person from Georgia or the Carolinas. They kind of operated independently, but the Stamp Act united them. This brings us to subpoint D. Liberty was the most important word to critics of the Stamp Act. People staged mock funerals. They would carry these little coffins that said liberty on them. In Boston, and really, like Boston is the heart of New England. They were the biggest rabble rousers of the group. In Boston, protesters hanged an effigy of a stamp distributor. They took like the scarecrow of a stamp distributor, and they hanged him in the square on a large elm tree in order to persuade the actual stamp collector to go resign his post. That tree, that elm tree in Boston, became known as the Liberty Tree, and images of the tree appeared in pamphlets of the American patriots. Open air meetings were held under that Liberty Tree, and then eventually that area became known as Liberty Hall. Shopkeepers and artisans and laborers, they all rallied to the cause. They intimidated royal officials throughout the colonies. These angry mobs of men who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, they demanded the resignation of tax collectors. They destroyed the property of anybody who supported the imperial authority of the king. The rioters had a lot of reasons to protest. There was the resentment of military officers, the religious passions against the arrogance and the corruption of royal bureaucrats, and just simply, and we can't ever say this enough, just the excitement of the thrill of the moment. In Boston and in other colonies, people formed a committee of correspondence. A committee of correspondence would go exchange ideas about the resistance. You also got to, this was a letter writing club where people would go and, stir up ideas against the Stamp Act, against the unfair treatment. To us today, this doesn't sound like, really, that's what you would do? That doesn't sound really great. But this was an era before Snapchat and emails, and if you wanted to go tell somebody about your position, you wrote it down and sent it to them. So there's all these old committees that organized letter writing campaigns. And popular resistance throughout the colonies, it nullified the Stamp Act, and frankly it stunned Parliament, who said, whoa, we didn't make everybody mad. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. This success, this moment where the rabble of the colonies was able to convert Parliament and get them to cancel their tax, it confirmed patriot ideology that the consent of the governed is what leads itself to government. That it was the people who are under the thumb of the government who give their position, they give permission to the government to enforce laws upon them. Still, though, Parliament didn't quite give in to this. They passed what was known as the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act reasserted Parliament's control, saying, listen, Parliament can pass whatever taxes it wants, or repeal any taxes it wants, but they retain the power to do so. Subpoint E. In the 1760s, two groups in the Carolinas grew up, and they became known as the Regulators. First, let's talk about the South Carolina Regulators. The South Carolina Regulators were mostly this group of wealthy backcountry residents who protested against the underrepresentation in the colonial assembly and the lack of local governments. So these are people in the backcountry of South Carolina, and they say, hey, we have our own colonial assembly, our own Congress, and people out here in the sticks, they don't have any voice in this. Movement to the western frontier created all these new disputes over Indian policy, over political representation, and debts. And in 1763, these really vigilante groups demanded greater political rights. They demanded local courts and fairer taxes, and were pretty successful. They won concessions and new courts and lower document fees, but honestly, they did fail to win any real power. The North Carolina Regulators are a little different, and they come up in 1766. They're a far more radical group of regulators, and it rose up in the backcountry of North Carolina. And it was caused by plummeting tobacco prices. So really the market of tobacco began to fall, and it was essentially the only industry in that part of the country at that time. And these farmers who were just carrying all of this debt, just all of a sudden they watch their future profits of tobacco just disappear, and they're forced into bankruptcy courts to go pay for it. To save their farms, though, these debtors, these farmers, they joined together with the regulator groups to go intimidate judges and to close courts and to free their comrades from jail. They demanded lower fees and taxes, as well as their own greater representation in their own assembly. The royal government in North Carolina wasn't really on board with this. The governor ordered the mobilization of the Eastern Militia against that regulator force. That Eastern Militia then resulted in the defeat of the regulators and the execution of their leaders. The North Carolina Militia defeated the North Carolina Regulators at the Battle of Almonte in 1771, and essentially that ended their protests. Some colonial elites, though, began to fear that anybody who wants to protest British measures should do it carefully, because it could unleash this turmoil at home. But it also meant that British policies would play a crucial role in the future of the maturing colonies. So if Britain goes and orders a new tax, then they're going to risk unrest. But that unrest also risks a retaliation by the governor's force, and this is a pretty uneasy moment. And this brings us to Roman numeral number 2. We're going to talk about how the resistance and how it's based in a real ideology to begin with. Ideology was actually a new word at the time. It was a word that was being thrown around by the French philosophers as an idea that, can you have an ideology? Can you have a study of ideas? Can a person commit themselves to a study of a particular idea? But let's talk about the ideology of the resistance. At first, American protests focused on particular things, these economic matters, these political matters. There was a specific thing that people were protesting against. But the patriot lawyers and the publicists, they also provided the resistance movement with an intellectual rationale, a political agenda, and a leadership. The movement transforms from like specific things, I don't like the Sugar Act, to a larger movement of individual liberty and collective liberty. Publicists drew on, I think we could say, three parts of the intellectual tradition. On one hand, you have English common law. English common law is a brilliant creation that evolves out of England in the Middle Ages that precedent should establish the way things operate. But also, the second piece, besides English common law, was the rationalist thought of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is this philosophical movement that says that people can understand the world around them. They can understand the scientific world, but that people also operate with certain scientific laws of behavior. And these social sciences can be known and understand and interpreted as well. That's how the Enlightenment goes and kicks off all of this thought about liberty, trying to find the natural law which governs people as well. And then third is an ideological agenda based on the Republican and Whig strands of the English political tradition. The Whigs were a group that basically, it was a political group in the House of Commons that was kind of against royal authority. It's a kind of a power to the people movement, or the Whigs. And so they have English common law, the Enlightenment philosophy, and these Whig strands of the political tradition. And then the publicists wrap all of these things together and turn these riots and protests from individual actions to this coherent political movement. And here's where I want to talk about subpoint B in the Townsend Crisis. The Townsend Crisis is named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a guy named Charles Townsend. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is essentially like the treasurer of England. It's the person in charge of, managing all of the money and collecting the taxes and stuff. And Charles Townsend argued for restrictions on colonial assemblies, and he argued for new sources of American tax revenue. He basically said these colonial assemblies they're getting to be too much. You've got Patrick Henry denouncing the rightful authority of Parliament to go tax. You got to rein them in a little bit because we need American tax revenue. This is expensive. These are expensive colonies to maintain. So to secure the revenue salaries of imperial officials in the colony. So people who are appointed, they're British empire people appointed in the colonies to go pay for their salaries. The Townsend Act of 1767 imposed all of these taxes on paper, on paint, on glass, and most notably to our story, a tax on tea, on basically any of those items that are imported into the American colonies. And it created a board of customs commissioners in Boston. It also created vice admiralty courts in Halifax, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Charlton, and all of these to go manage the tax revenues of the crown. By using parliamentary imposed tax revenues to finance the administrative and judicial innovations, Townsend threatened the autonomy and authority of individual American political institutions. That basically all of these colonies, which have been managing themselves in salutary neglect, are suddenly wrapped up in centralized power under the authority of, more or less, Charles Townsend. To limit any constitutional debate over any internal taxation, Townsend said that the taxes would only be on trade, anything imported to the colonies. And that's a type of tax that the colonists had not traditionally opposed. So he specifically says these are just import taxes. They're basically tariffs into our colonies. He believed that the colonists, they wouldn't object to these because they look like the trade regulation that the colonists had always been okay with. In 1768, though, the colonists began boycotting British goods. Rather than rely on British goods, colonists relied on homespun clothing. And the use of American goods became seen as the symbol of American resistance. So much of the colonies relied on imports from the home country and the triangle trade networks, but suddenly those things got real expensive, and as a way of sticking it to the man, the colonists said, we'll just make as much as we can here, even though it's harder, even though it may be more expensive. They're going to do it as a resistance movement. So women who would spin thread and weave cloth at home, they even take on the name the Daughters of Liberty. The American trade boycott eventually began to have a pretty major impact on the British economy. The rising trade deficit with the Americans convinced some British merchants to petition to Parliament that the Townsend duties were a mistake. Eventually it began to have like a real economic cost, not to the colonies, which were it was intended to, but to the merchants and traders of England. So in early 1770, the Prime Minister, a man named Lord North, he persuaded Parliament to accept a compromise plan. This compromise plan would repeal the duties on manufactured items, the things most important to the colonies, but it retained a tax on tea. And the tax on tea was really a symbol of Parliament's supremacy. It honestly didn't raise all that much money, even to tea-loving Britons and colonists, but it was more of just like, hey, just so you know, we can still have this tax if we want. England, I think we could say, began to think that the American colonies were out of control. Virginia had the rabble-rousers like Patrick Henry, but elsewhere, colonial judges, like judges in the colonies and governors, they're paid by Britain, but they were also secretly paid by local people. And those officials began to favor the colonists over the interests of the crown. So in March of 1770, colonists, upset by the Townsend Acts, they marched in Boston and they began taunting the British soldiers. Now, what I'm about to say next is a little bit murky. Historians have really always struggled to kind of put together these details, and the truth is we probably never know, will never know, but the accepted story kind of goes like this. In Boston, these crowds of angry people began circling around British soldiers. There's not really what we think of as policemen today. The soldiers were the cops to go hold the peace. So the crowd began circling around these soldiers, and they start mocking them and shouting them down and even picking up little pebbles and throwing them at the soldiers, or maybe even bigger than pebbles, right? And then the crowd began to get rowdy, and they started ringing church bells. Church bells are an interesting alarm in a pre-modern world. Church bells were a signal of a lot of things. They could be symbols of good tidings if they're done during the day. They could be symbols of mourning if they represent funerals. But in the evenings, church bells mean an emergency, and they probably mean fire. And fire is a pretty serious problem in a city constructed of wood before running water can pump a fire truck. A fire means everybody needs to grab a bucket and come and help. And so the soldiers, they're starting to get surrounded by this angry mob, and the tensions are getting louder, and suddenly there's the emergency peals of the church bells, and the local sentry got called in, and then they got mixed up with the shuffle, and one soldier fired a musket into the crowd. And that one shot set off a storm of gunfire, killing 5 people. The first person killed in the attack was a mixed-race sailor, a guy named Crispus Attucks, and he was the first American actually killed in the Revolution. Now, those soldiers get tried in court for what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. And here we have kind of an interesting wrinkle to the story. A Boston attorney, a Massachusetts attorney, is called to go defend the British soldiers. Okay, now we got to put this in line here, right? I mean, Boston is the heart of New England, and New England is the loudest, angriest part of America at the time. And you have a Boston attorney who's not representing Bostonians, but he's walking into the lion's den to go represent the British soldiers who fired on the crowd. This guy's name was John Adams, and he becomes one of my favorite people in American history. John Adams has his problems, but I feel like John Adams and I are a lot of the same person. Everybody imagines themselves in the Revolution as like to be as noble as Washington or as poetic as Jefferson. But the truth is, on a Tuesday, I'm John Adams myself. But John Adams defended the soldiers in court, and he did so admirably, so that 7 of them were found not guilty, and 2 of them convicted of manslaughter. It made Adams pretty unpopular for a while, but I think it says a lot about how much justice is really the issue here, not vengeance. Paul Revere immortalized the moment of the Boston Massacre in an engraving. He's a silversmith, right? So he's a man of the details. He also produces these engravings that could be used in print. And it's wholly inaccurate, but it stirred up the anger throughout the colonies, and it created a resentment towards the crown and towards Parliament. The outrage of the Boston Massacre was so strong, and the propaganda, people like Paul Revere's propaganda, was so severe that it was so effective that Parliament knew that, hey, the Townsend Acts are up. And so they repealed most of the taxes, but they kept that tax on tea. The boycotts ended when the Townsend duties were repealed. But in subpoint D, let's talk about the Tea Act. The Tea Act was a symbolic move. It didn't raise much money, and the truth is that tea isn't necessary for life. The East India Company is a British trading company. It was in financial crisis, and the British government decided to market the best-selling product of the British East India Company, and that was tea. And it was Chinese tea, which could be sold well in America. The Tea Act was actually there to go help the East India Company defray the costs of shipping, to like prop them up, and also to go like lower the cost of the colonial government. The act made the East India Company's tea actually cheaper than the Dutch tea, which Americans had been using to go get around the tax. So like they were smuggling in Dutch tea because it was cheaper than British tea, but as soon as they repeal the Tea Act, the British tea gets cheaper, but the patriots in America basically accused the ministry of bribing Americans. They say, oh, now you're just trying to buy off our loyalty and to give up our principled opposition to any British taxation. This is where we meet Samuel Adams, a cousin to my spirit animal, John Adams. Samuel Adams established a committee of correspondence and formed a communication network between Massachusetts town, and all of which where the goal was to stress individual colonial rights. And it would expand over a number of colonies. The Patriots effectively nullified the Tea Act by forcing the East India Company ship to go return to Britain or go store the tea in public warehouses. When the East India Company's ships approached port, say in Philadelphia and New York, there, these ships full of tea were refused to go pull into the harbor. They say, no, if you pull into the harbor, then we'll have to go pay the tax on it. So, no, our ports are closed. You can't pull in. That's really tough on a shipping ship. They're not meant to just like anchor out at sea. They're meant to get into port and get moving. And then plus you have all these wares that are just sitting on your ship and not being sold and tying up all of the finances there. In Charleston, it's a little different. In Charleston, the ships were allowed to dock and unload, but they take all of the tea and they push it into warehouses, and then they say, oh, no, we can't go pay the tax on this because it's in the warehouse and it's not been sold, but we unloaded, so you're welcome to pull out, but they refused to pay the tax in Charleston. And in Boston, 3 ships docked in the harbor, and they said, okay, no, we're not going to get fooled. We heard what happened down in Charleston. We're not going to unload any of this stuff until you could pay the tax on it. The town of Boston refused, but the tax collector refused to let the ships go until the tax was paid. And the tensions were high when, in the middle of the night, 200 men boarded the ships and threw more than 300 chests of tea into the Boston harbor. Britain's response to that action was swift and harsh, with several laws to force the colonies to submit, and in particular Massachusetts. The Boston Port Bill closed the Boston harbor to shipping until somebody paid for that tea. So basically they shut off the Boston harbor, which was pretty hard on the Boston economy. The Massachusetts Government Act said, okay, and this Massachusetts colony, no, we are stripping your charter. You are no longer a legitimate colony, and we're going to prohibit any town meetings, and you can't meet, and you can't pretend you're a government because you're not, we've just pulled your charter. And the Quartering Act mandated brand new barracks for the British troops, and a Justice Act which allowed trials for any capital crimes to be transferred back to Great Britain. So if you've been accused of a crime that was like a capital crime, that was a question of murder or things that could get you executed, you didn't face that trial in the colonies where you could go pay off your local judge. No, you get on a boat and you go 6 weeks back to Great Britain and you'll have the trial there. And then there's an act that to us moderns, I think we have a hard time wrapping our heads around it. It's called the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act said that the colony of Quebec in Canada, they said, okay, Quebec's not having any of these problems. They're not uniting. It's also a North American colony, but they're not stirring up trouble. It's a fairly new colony. They got it after the French and Indian War, but you know what? They're on the side of rule and peace. And so the Quebec Act said the Quebec colony could have greater territory, and basically like, you guys are doing a good job. We're going to give you new land, and it began to surround the 13 American colonies. Probably because Quebec wasn't in the rebellion, but it granted also wide religious tolerance for Catholics in Canada. And boy, if there's anything that would have stirred up American vim and vigor, it's tolerating Catholics. It also restored the Catholic Church's right to impose tithes and that they could go collect taxes for the Catholic king. You remember the British colonies, like England has its own religion, and it's not Catholic. It also restored French civil law for some matters of private law, and the colonists, like the 13 colonies, look at this and they say, what in the world? This isn't, like, come on. You're being unfair. And the Patriots branded these measures the intolerable acts. These intolerable acts would serve as the catalyst for future protests in the colonies. And from there, the story explodes, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.